and welcome to episode 37 of Book Writing Tips, quick tips for new and seasoned authors, and I am your host, Alba Arango. In today's episode, I want to talk about the difference in writing dialogue versus narrative, because they are different in the words that you use, in the way they are written. So I want to talk about the distinctions between the two and how using the two of them in balance really makes for a great story. So with no further ado, let's get right down to it. How do you write dialogue versus narrative? Alrighty then, today's episode will be in two parts as always. In part one, I will talk about writing dialogue and try to give some tips about what makes effective and really good and interesting dialogue. And then in part two, I will talk about how completely different it is when you write narrative. And then I'll end with kind of how you can kind of combine the two to make for really good storytelling. So all right, let's get down to it. Part one, and writing dialogue. Now, one of the things I will say, and I just will make this disclaimer right now, is that all of these are just tips. In the end, it is your book, and you are going to write your book however you want to. But most of the tips I am giving you today are things that I have heard not just from other authors, but from both agents and publishers at various writers' conferences and a lot of online articles I have read from agents and publishing houses. So I'm hoping that they are going to give you a little bit of insight to what the industry is looking for, but push come to shove, in the end, it is your book. So if you are going to look for an agent, then these tips are probably going to be very helpful for you. Or if you want your book to be industry standard, if you're self-publishing, then these tips are probably going to be good for you. But if you are writing your story for yourself, and you really just are adamant that you want it to be this way, then absolutely, it is your story and keep it as is for sure. However, these are just my suggestions, so let's get down to it. My suggestions about writing effective dialogue. Now, I believe I've already done an entire podcast episode on writing dialogue, but I just want to give you a few more tips about really making your dialogue sound believable. So let's get down to it. First of all, dialogue is important in character development. What your characters say says a lot about them, just like in real life, right? When you hear someone talk, what they say says a lot about who that person is. So you want, to use dialogue for character development. So you do want, and I know you'll hear this on my other podcast and you'll hear this in other podcasts as well. You want each of your characters to have a kind of distinctive voice so that you can actually tell who is speaking, not just character tags, but actually by what they say, because each character kind of should have their own sort of way of speaking. Now that I said that and saying that it is important for different characters to sound different, it is also just as important for your one character, let's say your main character, to probably sound different when they speak to different people. So think about even yourself in real life. You probably speak a little differently to say your mom than you do to say your spouse, than you do to say your kids, than you do to say your dog. So I always think about myself, like I walk into the room and there's my mom and there's my dog. And the way I talk to my dog is very different than the way I talk to my mom. So you got to think about that when you're writing your story. If your character walks in, the dog runs up to her, and what is your character going to say? I mean, I know what I say when I see my dog and I walk in and I sound like a complete nut job. And you know what? I'm okay with that because that's the way I speak with dogs. So think about that. Your character actually speaks differently to different people, just like you do. Now, if your character is a kid, that is for sure true, right? Kids talk amongst themselves, and if you overhear kids talking. I mean, I was a high school teacher for 25 years. I hear the way kids talk to each other. It's very different than the way they talk to most of them, all right? Than the way they speak to their parents, or the way they speak to their grandparents, or the way they speak to their teachers, or the way they speak to, older adults. It's just different. And the same is, of course, true. You probably speak to your spouse and use words and things that the two of you kind of share this connection, or your siblings, right? I mean, you would probably banter with your siblings in a way you probably would not banter with like your colleague. So that should be in your writing. When you're writing dialogue, you should be speaking differently, your character speaking differently to different characters, and it should kind of be obvious to your reader as to why. I mean, your reader would get it if they sound and, speak with different words to their parents out of respect than they do to say their, lover. It's just a different way of speaking, and that's kind of cool, and you definitely want that in your story. Now, having said all of that, you do want your speech to be realistic. And I have oftentimes, when you hear like young authors, I don't necessarily mean to be young, I mean new authors tend to not notice that their dialogue is a little unrealistic. Like they use a lot of proper words, proper nouns that maybe their character wouldn't normally use. And I remember there was an author writing a young adult book. And I remember thinking, and it was one of the critiques I gave them in a loving way, of course, that does not sound like a teenager. If this is taking place today, that's just not how teenagers speak. I mean, they just, and this was not in speaking to like their parents. This was like speaking to other teenagers, like a group of teenagers speaking together. And I'm like, okay, even like the smarty pants kids that I taught in like the International Baccalaureate problem did not speak to each other in that kind of proper grammar. Like it's just not the way kids speak. So you want your speech to be realistic. Now, having said that, and having taught high school for 25 years, you also don't want to write exactly how kids speak to each other, because you do not need your book to be filled with so many F-bombs that any agent or like publisher is like blushing as they're reading this, because, oh my gosh, you don't really need that many F-bombs in a conversation. So kind of keep that in mind too. Like you can go overboard with things like that. So kind of keep that in mind. Now, another thing, interruptions. Interruptions are realistic. Like if you're talking to your kids, things are going to interrupt you. Other kids are going to interrupt you. Your spouse is going to interrupt you. If you're having a conversation with your pal, your kids are going to interrupt you. Like these are like normal things that happen in real life. So you need to think about that too. And also think about, people sometimes don't say exactly what they mean or exactly what they're thinking. So body language, and this is where we're going to get to narration in a minute. This is where narration and dialogue really work so well together, because people will say one thing, but then their body language is kind of saying something else. And that makes for beautiful storytelling, because I want to talk about how balancing narration with dialogue is so important in a story. But before I get to narration and then using the two together, it's time for the crazy law / writing prompt. And if you're new to the show, every week I give you a crazy law. And this is a law that once upon a time was a real law in history. And your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to write a story based on that law. And it could be any kind of story. It could be a story about the law. It could be a story about why the law became a law. It could be a story about, you find out about it and it prompts you to do something else. So whatever it is, it's just a way to kind of flex your writing muscles and give you a distraction from your work in progress. So here we go. This week's crazy law. In Star, Mississippi, a law prohibits anyone from ridiculing the public architecture. Now, I don't know about you, but I suddenly want to drive out to Star, Mississippi to see the public architecture, to see why they felt they actually needed to make this a law. But there you go. That's your challenge for the week. But now let's get down to it. Let's get down to how different it is in writing narration. Now, narration is when not the characters are speaking, the narrator is speaking. And before I get to anything else, one thing your narration absolutely needs to have, and it does not matter what genre, it does not matter, what you're writing in, your narration needs to have a specific point of view, and it needs to have a specific tense. So, for example, if you want your narration to be in first person, then the whole book should be in first person. And if you're going to write some of it in first person and some of it in, say, third person, there needs to be a reason why. And that reason needs to be pretty important because you really throw your readers for a loop when you switch point of views from like third person to first person. Now, if you're switching from, third person and you're omniscient and you're writing from like all the different characters, that's different, right? That's different. But that's your choice. You're choosing to write in third person omniscient. So stay in third person omniscient throughout the entire book. Or stay in first person throughout the entire book. And you can be in third person limited and you can switch from character to character. You just need to have a scene change or a chapter change to let the reader understand that you're switching points of view. But the tense is also very important. I have seen many times new authors are, in past tense and then suddenly they're in present tense and suddenly they're back to past tense and then present tense, and they're going back and forth in their verb usage, and it's really jarring for a reader. So if you're going to do it in past tense, stay in past tense. If you're going to do it in present tense, stay in present tense. Either one is good. Present tense is really popular right now in YA, so maybe that's where you want to go if you're writing YA. But again, it's your story. Write it in whatever tense you want, but pick a tense. Now, having said all of that, obviously dialogue is completely different than that. Dialogue is people speaking, and people speak the way they speak in present and past tense both. But narration is different. Narration should be woven throughout the story, and it should have a flow to it in the same tense. Having said that, just a couple of really quick things about narration that I hear a lot from agents and publishers, and that is do avoid, an information dump. Don't just do paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of narration because you need to get this story told. Dialogue needs to be in there. It should be interwoven. This makes for a beautiful story and a flow that readers love. So make sure you're not just doing paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of description with absolutely no dialogue interwoven. And the other thing, of course, is show, don't tell. And I will do an entire podcast on show, don't tell because it is so very important. But I will give you an example of showing in the narrative as opposed to telling. So instead of having your character say, they're putting something, they just got this package from Amazon and they have to put this crazy contraption together, instead of just having them be like, oh, I'm so frustrated. Which, okay, that is possible. I will admit myself, I do say that sometimes, I'm so frustrated. But I say that more as like an overexertion, usually to someone who walks in the room, just so, as comedic relief. But I say that. But if you really want to show the reader that your character is frustrated, then you don't need to have them say, I'm so frustrated. You can literally just have them be like, ah! And, throw the screwdriver down and then sit there and breathe heavy a couple times and inhale and exhale and then pick up the manual and read it again. And that is a way to show frustration without actually having the words, I'm so frustrated, come out of the character's mouth. Now, narration, and this is one thing that I have heard over and over from both agents and publishers, your narration should be more refined than your dialogue. It should be proper grammar. You aren't using the word like ain't and stuff like that in your narration. That's great for dialogue because that shows character, that provides a lot of depth to your character's persona. But in narration, it should be sentences. It should be proper grammar. It should be more refined. You will use a lot of detail that you would not use in dialogue. So, for example, if your character sees this rose and they're like, oh my gosh, that rose, it is so beautiful. And in the narration, you could explain, how the rose is red, but it has the tips almost like burned orange and the center was a bright yellow, which you would not have your character say. You would not have, oh my gosh, that rose with the bright red petals and the bright orange, burnt orange tips with the yellow center. You're not going to have your character say all of that. That's perfect for narration. And then to have it kind of, interwoven, where you give the description of the rose and then your character's reaction to it in her words. Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. That's how you interweave your dialogue and narration. Now, again, the whole balance between narration and dialogue should be strewn throughout your entire novel. There should be bits of narration and then dialogue that kind of reemphasizes it, and then your character's reaction. And even if you have like two people in conversation, and this is what I mean by interweaving. If you have two people in a conversation, you definitely do not want it to be literally nothing but dialogue and they're in a vacuum. I mean, they're like in the cone of silence having a conversation. That's not reality. No one wants to read that. You want to see the reactions. I mean, if someone's voice is rising in this conversation because they're having a heated argument and they're in like a restaurant or a coffee shop, I mean, people around are going to notice this. And one of your characters should be like uncomfortable that the other person's voice is raising so loud that they're looking around and everyone's looking at them and they're feeling like, guilt or shame or embarrassment or, something. And they're like, shh, keep your voice down. And then, but you need to have the reader see what your character is seeing, and that is that people in the restaurant are, giving dirty looks or they're looking over at you. You need to see that. Your readers need to see that. There needs to be distractions. There needs to be, interruptions. There needs to be things going on in this conversation that your reader should be seeing. Your reader should be seeing the conversation where it takes place, and they should be seeing the reactions to the other characters. I mean, if your character says something and the other character like their eyebrows shoot up in surprise, the reader needs to see that their eyebrows shot up in surprise. There needs to be that bit of description in there, that bit of narration to give your readers the visual besides the audio, because that's what you're doing. You're creating a story that has visual and audio, and you want to make sure both of those are present in your book. All right. I hope these sort of tips have given you some ideas when you're writing about narration versus dialogue. And if you liked it, please, please, please give this episode a like. If you have any comments, please drop them in the comments. I drop a new episode every Wednesday. So until next week, I hope you all stay safe, and I hope 2026 is treating you with joy. And if you are experiencing any kind of writing dilemmas, please look at all my other podcast episodes. Maybe something in there can help get you through that frustration that you are feeling. And I hope I see you next week. Until then, take care. And I'm sending you all big hugs and wishes for prosperity in this new year.